Hi, welcome to Safe Church Basic Training. Thanks for coming along today and doing the Safe Church Basic Training that must be completed in order to be compliant with the PCV Safe Church implementation across Victoria. A little bit about me. My name's Fiona. I'm the trainer for Safe Church and I'm going to be with you for these 4 sessions as we work through the material in your training booklet. The training booklet has been given to you so that you can make sure you're following along and you know where we're up to in the training. Thank you so much for giving of your own time to come along and do the basic training. I'm very aware that there's other things you'd much rather be doing than sitting here with me now and going through this material, but it's really important material and it will help you understand your ministry role better and also how the church understands and responds to abuse in the church. My role as a trainer is to make sure that everyone in the PCV who is mandated to complete the Safe Church training has done so. And I'm really grateful that I'm helped in this role by the Safe Church representatives in all the churches across Victoria. So before we begin, I just want to acknowledge and thank the Safe Church reps who are actually facilitating this training along with me. So a big thank you to you. By you attending Safe Church Basic Training, you help us make the Presbyterian Church of Victoria a much safer place for all of us, children, vulnerable adults, everybody in our church. At one point in the training, we're going to break into a smaller group to work through a scenario. If you're wondering, oh dear, I'm not in a training group, please don't worry. What we'll do is we will just work through the scenario together with the people we're sitting next to. At the time, you'll be given the scenario by the facilitator in your training session. If you have any questions about the material, remember, you can always email the Safe Church unit. The email address is in your booklet, or you can give the Safe Church unit a call. Again, the phone number is in the booklet. Please know that your questions are always welcome. We love to hear feedback, and we're also very much wanting to make sure that you understand the material. So any concerns that you have, please know you can give the Safe Church unit a call. Now, before we begin the material, a couple of things to mention. The first thing is to say that you're going to hear me say the word churches quite a lot in the training. I use the word churches not to target the Presbyterian Church of Victoria, but actually I'm going to be talking about Australian Christian churches in general. So when you hear the phrase churches in the training, just remember we're talking about all Christian churches, all traditions and denominations in Australia. A final thing to mention just before we get into the material of Section 1. There will be people here today for whom we go through this material and it's entirely academic. What do I mean by that? Well, the fact is that the topic of abuse is actually an upsetting thing to look at. Some of the material we're going to examine is the kind of material you would not choose to look at on your own. It's not the kind of thing that you would find yourself wanting to do, but it's important material, and as you'll find out, it's material that we need to understand so we can do our ministry for the Lord in the church in a really positive way, so we're fully understanding the situation and the environment that goes with abuse in the church. You could be, though, a person for whom the topic of abuse is not academic. It might be that actually you've suffered abuse. It could be that someone close to you has experienced abuse. It could be a deeply personal topic for you. If you're finding the material is upsetting and difficult and you're feeling affected, please know that you're not alone. The church stands with you and we want to help you. If you're finding you're affected by the material, then I encourage you to reach out to a senior leader. I encourage you to talk to someone. But you know, if there's no one that you feel you can talk to, please call the Safe Church unit. We have a number of recommended Christian counsellors across Victoria, and we are very happy to hear from you and make sure you get in touch with someone who can support you, who can give you the resources so that you can walk through this journey and come out the other side of it. So just remember, if you're finding that you're feeling affected by this material today, you can take a break, you can go out and come back in when you feel ready, but also know you're not alone and there are people who can help you. So let's begin section 1. We're on page 2 of your training booklet. We're going to start by asking, what is Safe Church? Safe Church is the PCV's commitment to abuse prevention and response in the church. It's also the policy and process for responding to abuse in the church. And you will be aware that the PCV has actually had a policy and process for responding to abuse in the church for quite a number of years. The government has indicated that the prevention of child abuse and the response to child abuse is a community issue. And part of that means training people like you and me in churches so that we understand the issues that surround child abuse and we know what to do if we're ever in a situation where we think a child might be at danger or perhaps they are currently being abused. We also look at abuse that occurs between adults in the church as well in basic training. So Safe Church covers abuse not just in relation to children, but also in relation to adults in the PCV. So how often do you need to complete Safe Church training? You complete the Safe Church basic training once. You then view the Safe Church refresher course video once a year online at the PCV Safe Church YouTube channel. If you are not online, please call the Safe Church unit and we will send you a paper version of the refresher course. From 2018, advanced training will commence for selected leaders such as elders, ministers and ministry leaders. All information about advanced training is found at the Safe Church website on the training page. But for now, we're going to complete the Safe Church basic training together. There are 4 sections and we'll work through each one of them. So please turn with me now to page 3 of section 1. Here you'll see what this section covers. Remember, you can always refer back to this material again at a later stage. In basic training, we're going to build a picture. And the picture is, what is it that makes a safe church? We're going to look at all the elements that make a safe church. And that's what we do as we work through the sections together. But before we go any further, we need to lay the basis of the training from the foundation of Scripture. If you've done this kind of training before in your professional life, and a number of people in our church have, you would have done much of the same material. But the difference is we're doing this as God's family. We're in His kingdom, and so whatever we do in the church, we want to make sure that we're doing it from the foundation of Scripture. And Safe Church basic training is no different. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the time to look at the Scriptures together today. So why do we need Safe Church? We're on page 3 of section 1. The Bible shows us that we live in a moral universe because it is created by the Holy God. Therefore, our actions matter. They have consequences and affect relationships. The doctrine of the Trinity tells us that relationship and personal relationships are not incidental to reality, but are the heart of reality. So now we've read that quote together, you'll see there's a reflection question to complete. Let's take a couple of moments now just to do that together. Please pause the video until ready to resume. So now we're going to turn to the Scriptures together and we're going to think a little bit about the foundation for the training. Remember, you must read the Safe Church Policy and the Safe Church Code of Conduct in your training booklet. These are the documents that you will be held accountable to, and if there are any issues, These are the documents the Church will refer to in order to respond. So let's have a look now at 4 key scriptures that give us a sense of where the Bible takes us on this journey of abuse prevention and response.
We know from the Bible that, as human beings, we are made in the image of God. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. Genesis 1:27. God has a special concern for the vulnerable, especially children. Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." Matthew 19:14. Jesus commands us to express our love for God in how we treat others. Jesus answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself." Luke 10:27. Jesus treats our actions towards others, particularly those under our leadership and care, with the utmost gravity. Jesus said to his disciples, "Things that cause people to stumble are bound to come, but woe to anyone through whom they come. It would be better for them to be thrown into the sea with a millstone tied around their neck than to cause one of these little ones to stumble. So watch yourselves." Luke 17:1-3a.
Thank you for taking the time with me just to look at the scriptures and see what the Bible has to say when we think about abuse prevention and response in the church as God's children. You'll see there's a reflection question there, and now let's take the time to do that reflection question and think through some of the things that come into our minds when we read what the scriptures have to say in these 4 Bible verses. Please pause the video until ready to resume. So everything we do in our roles in the church must be grounded in Scripture, and that's the foundation of Safe Church in the Presbyterian Church of Victoria. Do you remember I said we were going to build a picture today? So let's lay the first part of our picture, the foundation, which is the Bible. We're now on page 4 of section 1, and we're going to talk about getting the balance right. When we talk about this, we have to understand that when we think about abuse, when we engage with the topic of abuse, that we already have some well-formed opinions, even if we're not conscious of them. What you and I think about the topic of abuse could be informed by a lot of different things. You might have an opinion about it based on your own experiences. You might have an opinion about it based on the experiences of those close to you, maybe family, maybe friends. What we read in the media can affect how we think about this topic. What we hear on the radio, see on the television, maybe you've read a book on the topic. But it's really important to understand that you will have some ideas about it already. One of the things we want to do in basic training is actually pause and think about, what do I think about abuse as a subject? Where do I sit on the spectrum of understanding abuse prevention and response in our churches? You know, it wasn't uncommon historically for Christian churches in Victoria to underplay or even ignore the topic of abuse in the church. Tragically, where that kind of attitude and that kind of approach prevailed, many people were damaged, they were abused, and they suffered great harm. It's really a great thing for the church that those days are over. But we need to understand that because of the widespread historical abuse in Christian churches in Australia, we must understand that the trust that was previously placed in the church for generations has been seriously eroded. In fact, if you weren't a Christian and you never went to church, and all you understood about what happens in churches was based on what you see and hear in the news. In the last few years, you would have an understanding of the church that said to you that the church was not a safe place. We just have to recognise this, and we need to understand that that influences everything that we do in the eyes of the community. In the past, sexual abuse was generally not spoken about. If it came out that sexual abuse was happening in a church setting, sadly, the victim was encouraged to be quiet. Often the offender was moved on and able to repeat the behaviour elsewhere in the church, and the situation covered up. Where this kind of approach prevailed, terrible damage was done to people, and terrible damage has been done to the reputation of the church as well. Thankfully, those days are over. So change has come to the church from both inside and outside the church. Nowadays, the church understands that we need to be proactive about preventing abuse, but we also need to be educated about what abuse actually is and then know how to respond to it. This is a protective thing for the people in our church. It's a protective thing for the children in our church. It's a protective thing for the church as a whole. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about getting the balance right. It's really important that we don't underplay the risk of abuse in the church, but it's also really important that we don't overstate the risk of abuse in the church as well. Thinking now about the spectrum there on your page, take a moment to think about where do you sit on that spectrum and then complete the reflections just below. Please pause the video until ready to resume. Now let's turn to the next element of building a safe church, the walls or the boundaries of a safe church. And in the Presbyterian Church of Victoria, the wall or the boundaries of the safe church are our policy and our code of conduct. These are really important documents, and as someone in the role that you do in the church, you need to abide by these documents. So the code of conduct is helpful because it's really a very clear expression of what is okay in the Presbyterian Church of Victoria. Another question you might have when you look through the code of conduct is, you might see a phrase there, reportable conduct. What is reportable conduct? It's a good question. Reportable conduct is anything in the code that is explicitly banned or ruled out. You also might see the term grooming or coercion behaviour is used as well. If you're confused about what grooming or coercion behaviour is, don't worry. We'll cover it later in the training in section 2. So the Safe Church policy and the code of conduct together form the walls or boundaries of that picture we're building today of a safe church. Remember, these walls relate to the abuse of both children and adults in the church. In addition to the Presbyterian Church of Victoria Safe Church program, the Presbyterian Church of Australia has adopted a national safe ministry framework for itself. Safe Church PCV also conforms so far as possible, bearing in mind the particular state-based requirements of the Victorian State Child Safety legislation. The National Safe Ministry Framework aims to advance God's glory, protect children from harm, help the church to maintain a good relationship with outsiders, and guide potential offenders away from the destructive paths of sin. In your own time, please read through the National Safe Ministry Framework principles in your training booklet. So let's sum up this part by reminding ourselves that Safe Church is not a side issue of ministry where we just tick a box and we think, I did the training, I know all that. Actually, In the church, we need to get abuse prevention and response right, because when we do that well, we can get on with the core ministry of the church, and that is showing the love of God, fellowshipping together, and taking the good news of Jesus Christ to the world, to our community, to those around us. Nothing shuts down a ministry faster than an abuse case. Nothing closes a church faster than an abuse case badly handled. If we can get Safe Church right, if we know how to respond to abuse, if we know how to prevent abuse just as we go about our ministry in the church, and we have some great practices, preventative practices, then all of this contributes to the core mission of the church, which is to make disciples for Jesus Christ, show the love of God, and fellowship together in His name. So why undertake training for Safe Church? Well, partly it's so you can understand where the denomination sits on the matter of abuse prevention and response, but it also is going to help you in your ministry. It means that you might know what to do if you're encountering a situation with abuse in your church. Training is aimed at helping you do the very thing that you want to do, serve God and His people. So who are the Safe Church Unit? The Safe Church Unit has been tasked by the General Assembly of Victoria to implement the Safe Church policy and code of conduct, and it's also tasked with abuse prevention and response in the church in general. So the Safe Church Unit acts as a funnel for issues and concerns relating to abuse in the church to make sure they get to the right avenue for resolution. Sometimes that avenue is going to be inside the church, other times it's going to be outside the church. But just remember that the Safe Church Unit is not the judge or jury. We're here as a resource so that concerns can get funneled to the right avenue for resolution. And that the Safe Church Unit is a resource for you. The Safe Church Unit is here to help the church. The Safe Church Unit is not the police. Victoria already has a police force, but the Safe Church Unit is the place to go with concerns, with reports, with matters that worry you in relation to abuse prevention and response. Perhaps you just have a query about how you're currently running a ministry in your own church. Perhaps you want to know, what is best practice in this ministry? The Safe Church Unit is here to help you. The PCV complies with the Victorian Reportable Conduct Scheme. If you look at Appendix A of your booklet, you will find information there about the scheme. There are 5 types of reportable conduct, and anyone can make a report to the Safe Church Unit about this kind of conduct in regards to church employees or volunteers. All reports or concerns relating to reportable conduct scheme matters are to be directed to the Safe Church Unit. Please contact the unit either by phone or email. What I would say is never hesitate to make that call. Never worry about bothering the Safe Church Unit with a query or a concern. The right thing to do is to reach out and seek help. It's much better to voice a concern early, and we look into that situation and we find out that our worst fears are not realised. In other words, you might have a concern one day that you're seeing a situation of abuse in your church. But on reflection and looking into it, we discover that no, there's nothing wrong. That's the best outcome we could hope for. But you know, what we do know about abuse that is occurring is that when it's left alone, it gets worse over time. Abuse doesn't get better by itself. Abusers don't just stop abusing. So it's much better that you voice your concerns earlier rather than later. We're here to help. The Safe Church Unit is the appropriate and safe place to take those concerns. So let's sum up section 1. The Safe Church Policy and Code of Conduct apply to all of us who are in our roles in the church, and the Safe Church unit is here to help you. We're a resource. So if you need help in matters relating to Safe Church, please do get in contact. We've already completed section 1, and now we're going to move on to section 2, recognising and reporting abuse. Before I begin this section, I just want to call out that section in italics again in your booklet. You'll notice that we're going to look at some material that might be quite upsetting. It's not pleasant material. It's not material that you would choose to look at in a normal scenario. But we need to look at it. If you're finding that this is distressing for you, I want you to know you are not alone. The church stands with you and is ready to help you. I encourage you to reach out to a trusted leader and talk to them about it. But if you don't feel comfortable doing that, please know you can call the Safe Church unit. The number is in your training booklet, and we can help you get in contact with a recommended Christian counsellor. We have a number of recommended counsellors across Victoria, and we're really happy to help you. I think it's really important to remember that the topic we're looking at today, we're not looking at it for no reason. We're looking at it because we want to recognise abuse in our churches and then know what we need to do about it. As we cover the topic of abuse, you might find that some of this material is already familiar to you, or maybe it even seems obvious to you. That's fine. Look, it's always helpful to just refresh your memory and to think over these things again. What we're going to do is work through section 2. We're going to look at some material relating to children and some material relating to adults. We'll cover some of the laws in Victoria that relate directly into this space and help you understand what the legal requirements are when we're talking about reporting abuse. So let's begin with the introduction on page 10 of your booklet.
Understanding abuse. Abuse is a complex issue that seriously impacts a person's well-being. Abuse often occurs in environments where trust is involved, where a person in position of trust and/or authority misuses their position to harm another. Often, the recipient of the abuse is vulnerable in some way, whether due to their personal circumstances, for example, their age or gender, or because in the relationship the abuser is in a position of power or authority. Abuse means to treat someone with cruelty or violence, especially regularly or repeatedly. It also means to misuse something, for example sex, to bad effect or for a bad purpose. For example, sexuality expressed between a man and a woman in marriage is a right and godly thing, while sexuality expressed between an adult and a child is a wrong and ungodly thing. In effect, it means to cause harm. Abuse can occur in any of the following forms: physical, sexual, emotional, mental, and, mainly in the case of adults, financial. Abuse in the church is a serious concern and is the responsibility of leaders and all those who work with children, who are by their age particularly vulnerable, to do everything possible to prevent and to minimise the risk of abuse.
As you can see here, Safe Church Basic Training has a particular focus on child protection issues. Why is this? Well, you might be aware that recently we have discovered the disturbing and upsetting news that there has been way more child abuse occurring in Australian churches in the past than perhaps any of us ever thought was possible. This means that the subject of child sexual abuse in institutions such as churches is now a subject that has really gained attention from the community, and it also means that we understand now that there are some weaknesses and vulnerabilities inherent in church communities that make us vulnerable to people who would seek to access children through our activities as God's people in the church. There has been a significant legal change in Victoria in 2019. The Victorian Parliament on September 10, 2019 passed amendments to the Children, Youth and Families Act, which mean that people in religious ministries are added to the list of mandated reporters to Child Protection Services. The legislation states that a person in religious ministry means a person appointed, ordained, or otherwise recognised as a religious or spiritual leader in a religious institution. The law makes it mandatory for ministers and other appointed religious leaders to report child abuse, including when it is revealed to them during a confession. Under the law, ministers and religious leaders face up to 3 years jail if they don't report child physical and sexual abuse allegations. This law was supported by both the government and the opposition in the Victorian Parliament. Mandatory reporting refers to the legal requirement for nominated groups to report a reasonable belief of physical or child sexual abuse to authorities. There is no significant change for the PCV brought about by this legislation, as under failure to disclose and the existing Safe Church PCV reporting protocols, PCV personnel have essentially operated as mandatory reporters regardless. However, it is important that you know about this and understand that you must report child physical and sexual abuse. Take a look at the chart in your booklet. What I'd like you to do now is actually read through that chart in your own mind just to get a sense of the types of abuse and the indicators of abuse. Please pause the video until ready to resume. I suggest you read through this chart again in your own time. As someone who's a leader or as someone who works with children under 18, the Victorian Government requires us to actually know this material and be familiar enough with it so that if we saw something, if we suspected something, then we would actually have a framework within which to place that thing that's worrying us. As we minister to children, and as we work with churched and unchurched families, it is possible that one day we might be in a situation where we're seeing signs and symptoms of abuse. I really hope that that never happens to you. But if it does, we need to be prepared. And that's why it's important just to read through that chart. So even though it's unpleasant, and even though I know these aren't things you really want to be thinking about, it's important that we've done so. So thank you. Thank you for reading through that material. I'm now going to tell you a little bit of information about child sex offenders. Why am I going to do that? Well, one of the ways that child sex offenders have been able to covertly operate in churches in Australia has been by taking on roles and positions where they have access to children, and also by really taking advantage of the fact that a lot of people do not know how child sex offenders present and operate. In fact, part of creating an abuse prevention space in our church is by us all actually knowing some of the facts around how a child sex offender operates and accesses children. So let me share some of that information for you now. In the vast majority of child sex offences, the child, the victim, knows the offender. They may have a relationship through their family. They may have a relationship through the extended family, or they may have a relationship formed through activities in the child's life, such as going to a sporting club or coming along to a church activity. The offender is usually male, and this has been confirmed by every major study. It doesn't mean that women don't commit child sexual offences. They do. It's just that in the vast majority of cases, it is men. Offenders are usually heterosexual. The majority of adult sex offenders report beginning their patterns of abuse during their adolescence. Some child sex offenders report beginning their patterns of abuse within their own family first, and then repeating that behaviour, taking it outside of the family. the sexual abuse will usually continue until something or someone stops it. Offenders practice deceit. They are very good at hiding their actions. What they do is they work actively to construct a secret relationship with that child. They want to keep the abuse secret. They want to keep the abuse something that's only known to them and their victim. Child sex offenders are often the kinds of people that are very charming. They know how to groom not only a victim, but the victim's family, and indeed they will even groom the whole environment in which the child is involved. So, for example, a child sex offender is the kind of person who would really try and win over the leaders of a church or win over the parents of the child. And they would also be the kind of person that perhaps would really look for a role where not only can they access children legitimately, but where they could find a time and a space to be alone with the child, even if it's outside the ministry time. Offenders manipulate the system and they can appear very respectable. Offenders work actively sometimes to undermine the child's reputation. An example of this would be, they might say something like, "Oh, you know Pete. Pete has got such a good imagination. Honestly, he makes up the funniest stories, but we all know that's just Pete." Offenders look for vulnerable children. They look for children where they can find an in to that relationship. Now, that could be through a number of vulnerabilities. The child might be excluded by peers. The child might be from a family where there's not a lot of support for that child. Or maybe the child is part of a situation where they feel a little bit on the outer. That's a vulnerability, and offenders look to exploit those vulnerabilities. But other offenders are just literally looking for victims. So we just need to be mindful about child sex offenders that they are very cunning and manipulative people. They have no problems with saying anything in order to legitimately access children, to build relationships with the child's carers, and to actually groom an environment where they can offend against a child. When we know about these sorts of things, when we're educated, when we actually understand that as hard as it is to imagine, a child sex offender is just deliberately looking at setting up an environment where they can hurt a child, where they can sexually abuse a child. When we know that and we understand that, that helps us just reclaim some of the space in our churches so we can understand just how these people operate. When we're educated about child sexual abuse, and it's a topic that we don't shy away from, but actually we are willing to go there, we're willing to talk about it, we're willing to be educated, that is protective for the children that come into the church to hear about the love of God and experience the good news of Jesus Christ for themselves. Sadly, a common story in church child sex abuse cases is that when the victim came forward and actually spoke up about what was happening to them, they just weren't believed. Often the response instead was, "I know him, he's a godly Christian man, and he would never do that." A real concern for some people is the possibility of false allegations. And that's a valid concern. You will have seen that they're called out as a possibility in our Safe Church policy. However, what we need to understand is that regardless of those concerns and regardless of our policy and our code of conduct, anyone at any time could go to police or go to child protection with a false allegation. That's always been the case before Safe Church, and it remains the case after Safe Church. The main point we need to know is that our responsibility as leaders in the church and people that work with children, and even in a more broad sense, as you'll discover when we look at the Victorian laws around disclosing a sexual offence against a child, even more importantly, is our legal responsibility is to make sure that we speak up with any concerns we have relating to child sexual abuse in the church. Remember, boys and girls of any age can be sexually abused. Children must never assume to be lying about a claim of sexual abuse. When we know about child sexual abuse and we talk about it and we're educated about it, we reclaim space from offenders in our churches. And we say to the world, we're the Presbyterian Church of Victoria, we care about children, we are proactive in preventing abuse in our churches, and we want our churches to be a place of safety for children to come and find out about Jesus and grow in him. Finally, just remember that if we had any allegations to do with child sexual abuse, it's not up to us to judge the veracity of those allegations. That's a matter for police and eventually the judiciary system. Actually, our role is to be educated, aware, and ready to speak up if we have any concerns. So when we think about this topic, let's just remind ourselves that creating a safe space in our church requires us to be aware of the issues and be ready to speak up. Moving along now onto page 12 to the section that talks about what to do if a child discloses abuse to you. You'll see here there's a process you can follow, and it helps you know what to do. What we say is always follow the process and finish up by calling the Safe Church unit to report. Don't deviate from the process, don't take matters into your own hands, launch your own investigation, or go off asking people about, have you heard this and have you heard that? No, just follow the process and finish by contacting the Safe Church unit. This sort of process reminds us that actually our role in churches when a child discloses is to listen to them, support them, document what they've told us, make sure they're safe, and then get that information to the right place so that that child can be protected. So let's take some time now just to have a little look through that disclosure process for ourselves and read it through. Please pause the video until ready to resume. Let's now think about something that might happen if a child did disclose sexual abuse to you. What is it that they might say to you? Well, they might say, you can't tell anyone else. Now that's a really understandable thing for a child to say. The child has done something monumental. They have come forward and told a trusted adult that somebody is hurting them. And their biggest fear is most likely going to be that you will leave that conversation with that child and go straight to the person they've told you about and say, what's this I hear? Your child is telling me that these things are going on at home. Or I've heard this about you from that child. Look, it's really, really understandable that a child would say that, but it's not a promise that we can make to a child, hey, don't worry, I won't tell anyone. We can't make that promise. If that child is going to be protected and cared for and helped, then we must make sure that information gets to the right people. So what could you say to a child? Well, you'll see there that there are some ideas of things you could say. Our suggestion is that what you say is, thank you for telling me what you have told me. You've done the right thing. I'm only going to tell the people that I have to tell, and I certainly won't tell. And then you would name the name of the person they've told you about. Reassure them that you are not going straight off to that adult that they've just told you about, and that will really put their minds at ease. But let's just remember, we can't promise to keep this a secret, and we do need to get that information to the right place so the child can be protected. On page 12, you'll see there's a reflection question there. It's prompting you to think about what this might feel like in real life. It's helpful to reflect that we will feel quite torn between wanting to tell the child, yeah, we won't tell anyone, and also wanting to make sure that the child will be protected and helped. So we need to care for the child in the moment, but we also need to let them know the truth, which is we will only tell those we need to tell. So let's now look at the section that's talking about what and how to report. When do you know that you should report something that concerns you about the possibility of a child being abused? A common question is, when would you report something? Look, it's really clear that if you get a disclosure from a child, that is immediately reportable. So that, in a way, is the easy answer. But when we're thinking about the indicators of child abuse, and we're thinking about things that we might see in a child, not them disclosing, but things we might see in a child, how do you know when to speak up? I don't know about you, but the first time I read through those indicators of child abuse, I was struck by how many of those indicators are just a normal part of a child's life. For example, toileting problems. Well, most children go through toileting problems when they're toilet training. And what about just some bruises on a kid? If you've got a really active kid, then chances are they're going to fall over and get bruises. So a good question to ask is, when do you speak up with a concern when you're seeing indicators in a child? The first thing to say is we've always got to look at context. For example, if there was a child in your youth group who you knew had autism, for example, and you knew had some struggles around some normal behaviours, then you might not think that was child abuse. It's more likely to be connected with the wider context of the child. So what do you do? If you see just one indicator, well, is that just one indicator? What should you do when you see signs in a child? What we're looking for here is a pattern of indicators emerging over time. We're not talking about just a one-off thing. We're not just talking about when you happen to see one indicator in a child. So if you see one indicator, that's just one indicator. If you saw two, okay, you might make a note of it. If you saw 3 indicators in a child, look, it's better to voice your concerns now and we look into that situation and find out everything's okay than us squashing down those feelings because we've seen a number of indicators and we're not sure if it's time to speak up. Remember, over ministry time, in the course of a year or more with children, you're going to build that relationship with the child and you might see some of these indicators emerging. So go back to what we remember. We're looking for a pattern of indicators emerging over time. It's much better to speak up earlier rather than later. It's much better to be vigilant and wrong than to squash down things that we're worried about, minimise them and tell ourselves that we're just being silly, and then we all find out later that the very worst thing that we feared was happening to a child was happening. You can always call the Safe Church unit with any concerns that you have. Anything that is brought to the Safe Church unit is treated confidentially. Any concerns that you have will be heard. It's not a matter of telling yourself not to be silly and not worry. We're talking about a child's welfare, and it's worth making that call. If you feel anxious about making that call, you could chat to a leader, and then both of you could ring the Safe Church unit together just to chat through the situation. Now let's say that you really had a number of concerns and you're thinking it's time to report them. How can you do that? It's really important to remember that at any time, anyone can call the police or child protection. Anyone in the church can lift up the phone and make a report to the external authorities at any time. If you do that, could you please call the Safe Church unit afterwards and let us know that you've done so? That's so that, first of all, we can support you, support the local church, and we might have some resources that we could put in place to help you or even the child in that situation. But we also need to know so we can keep accurate legal records of what's happening in our church. But you know, it's a big call to make, isn't it? It's not an easy thing to lift up the phone and make that call. So, the Safe Church unit can also make that call on your behalf. Better that you call the Safe Church unit and we make that call and we get that concern to the right avenue than no one ever makes that call and that child is left in a potentially abusive situation. The Safe Church unit is here as a resource for you, and we are happy for you to contact us and let us know of your concerns so we can talk them through and make sure they get to the right avenue for resolution. At this point in section 2, we're now going to break into small groups and run through some scenarios. The scenarios will be handed out to you. Just work with the people around you. We're going to take 10 minutes to work through those scenarios, and what you're referring to is the disclosure process on page 12 of your booklet. Please pause the video until ready to resume. So now we're going to look at a subject known as grooming. Grooming or coercion behaviour is actually now a crime in Victoria. I want to call that out at the beginning of the section so that it's really clear that we are talking about a crime. In 2014, grooming became part of the betrayal of trust legislation. And you will have seen the fact sheets that have been also distributed to you with your training booklet today. Grooming is now a crime and it's punishable by a jail sentence in Victoria. So we need to acknowledge the gravity of this topic and acknowledge that it's not a small thing. So what is grooming? Well, I'm going to give you an analogy that hopefully will help you understand what grooming is. I'm going to talk about grooming a horse. So let me tell you a little bit about what it takes to groom a horse. When someone prepares a horse to show in an event, they take an animal, a horse, and they entirely change its appearance to such a degree that it can take part in a showing event. How do they do this? Well, they perform a series of small steps that lead to changing the entire overall appearance of the horse. So they do a number of small things in a pattern, in a sequence, over time that change the appearance of the horse. For example, they might pick the hooves, brush the mane and tail. They have several different brushes they might use to brush the coat of the horse. They might plait the mane and tail. There's a number of things that need to be done. If you do just one of those steps with the horse cannot be shown in the main event. If you do a couple of those steps when you groom a horse, the horse cannot be shown in the main event. No, it takes a number of small steps over time that build up to entirely change the appearance of the horse so that it can take part in the main event, which is the showing of the horse. Now, you know, I've never heard of anyone taking a horse from a stable and entirely grooming it, spending hours of time and completing numbers of steps, hard work to change that horse and then put the horse back in the stable. But likewise, I've never heard of someone turning up with an ungroomed horse, expecting that the horse could take part in the main event. Well, grooming children for the preparation of sexual abuse by an adult is almost exactly the same. The person doing the grooming performs a series of small steps, which taken on their own are only small steps, but taken together in a pattern that builds over time, ready that child for the commencement of sexual abuse. And this is why grooming is a crime in Victoria, because people do not groom children only to do nothing. They groom because they're leading that child up to the main event, which is the commencement of sexual abuse. And that's why grooming behaviour is specifically called out as a crime, but you will have noticed it's also called out in our code of conduct. So now that you know that information, that helps you. It helps you when you see things that worry you in a relationship between an adult and a child. If you suspect grooming is taking place, ask yourself the question, has the adult gone out of their way to convince you that their relationship with the child is entirely ordinary? In fact, have they gone out of their way to convince you that it's a healthy relationship for the child? What sort of things are you seeing that cause you concern? You'll see that we actually go through some of those sorts of behaviours. Things like favouritism, Things like constructing ways of making sure that the child can be alone with the adult in a way that they are not able to be seen by others. So if you have any concerns about grooming, remember it's better to speak up and be wrong. It's better to get those concerns to the Safe Church unit confidentially, where they can be handled confidentially and be wrong, than to squash those feelings, minimise those worries, and discount the things that you're seeing that are giving you that sense of disquiet or concern, and then we find out later that actually that child was groomed for the commencement of sexual abuse by an adult. Remember, we're talking about children's welfare. It's much better that we voice our concerns even if it makes us feel uncomfortable, because we want to protect children in our church. So let's now have a little look at why wouldn't you report child abuse? What would stop a person from reporting child abuse? Well, actually, there's some good reasons why people might not speak up. The first one is that people are concerned they might do something wrong and make the situation worse. That's a really understandable fear. A child in a potentially abusive situation is at far greater risk by being left in that situation than by being involved in a case with the police or with child protection. It's always best to voice our concerns, and it's legally appropriate to do so, as you'll see when we cover the reporting laws in Victoria. You know, people are also often afraid that they might expose the child to further abuse if they speak up. What if the abuser finds out and does something even worse to that child? Child Protection and Victoria Police are aware that this is a risk. They deal with reports concerning with child abuse in such a way that they do everything they can to minimise or remove those risks to the child in the course of the investigation. They work in such a way as to remove or reduce those risks. Remember, the abuser is the person who is responsible for their actions. The abuser is the person who has made the decision to behave in this way towards the child, and they are not going to stop unless they are stopped. If abuse is to be stopped, then reporting is the only thing to do. Sometimes a person might be afraid that they'll be culpable if it turns out that the report they made is actually not true. So they might worry that if they speak up, they will get in trouble if it turns out, after people looking into the situation, that there is no child abuse happening. And that's a really understandable concern as well. The Children, Youth and Families Act of Victoria actually protects reporters. How does it do that? Well, the first thing they do is they make sure that the identity of the reporter is not revealed. If the report is made in good faith, and in the church we're only going to make reports in good faith, the legislation ensures that the reporter is not liable for the eventual outcome of any investigation. A reporter who makes a report in accordance with the legislation is not liable for the outcome, is not breaching privacy, and is not in danger of defaming another person. Because of the protection offered by the legislation, we can have confidence that if we make reports concerning children, we know that we ourselves as reporters are protected at law. Another concern that might prevent somebody from reporting a suspected child abuser or a child in a situation of abuse is, how will you cope with that? It's really a huge emotional burden coping with dealing with a situation like this. I don't think we should underplay exactly how it feels to have a child in this situation that you know, and it can be really hard to carry that burden. Please know you won't carry it alone. The Presbyterian Church of Victoria is here to help you, and we will shoulder the burden with you. It's really important that you know that there's counselling support. It's really important that you know that even though you must keep the contents of this concern to yourself, you can debrief confidentially with someone in a way that helps you emotionally handle the situation. So remember, even though there are reasons that people might find themselves thinking and feeling that prevent them from speaking up about concerns relating to child abuse, even though we have those feelings and those fears, we are here to help you. The Safe Church unit is here to help you. The church is here to help you, and you won't go through this alone. We're now going to look at some of the Victorian laws relating to this area. You will see there that we're talking about the betrayal of trust legislation. We've already covered the grooming law. You'll also see some information there on page 16 relating to the new laws about sexting, and I encourage you to read that through yourself in your own time. I want to particularly emphasise two other laws as part of the Betrayal of Trust suite of laws for you to understand reporting of child abuse. Failure to disclose offence. Any adult who forms a reasonable belief that a child has been sexually abused has a legal duty under Victorian law to report this to police or Department of Human Services, Child Protection. So what is reasonable belief? Well, let's talk about what it's not. It's not rumours or speculation. It's not our negative feelings about a person. Let's say we didn't like someone's parenting style. It's not even general suspicion. And it's not a small piece of information that's taken out of context. For example, if you said to a child, tomorrow we're going to go visit Uncle Steve, and the child said, don't take me to Uncle Steve's house. I don't want to go. Don't make me. I don't want to see Uncle Steve. It doesn't necessarily mean that Uncle Steve is a child sex offender. It's more likely that Uncle Steve's house is boring. So let's think about what would reasonable belief be. There may be reasonable grounds to form a belief that a child is being sexually abused if a child or a young person states that they are being sexually abused. A child or a young person states that they know someone who is being sexually abused. This is because in a child's development, there is a stage where sometimes children will talk about themselves in the third person. Maybe someone else comes to you and tells you that they know that the child is being sexually abused. Or, of course, you might see indicators of child sexual abuse in the child and or their carer. That's why it's so important that we spent that time looking at those indicator charts so that we would have an understanding and a framework of what it is we might be seeing. So, if you had reasonable belief that a child is suffering from sexual abuse at the hands of an adult, the failure to disclose law means that you must speak up. You can call the police, you can call child protection. If you want, you can call the Safe Church unit and we can make those calls on your behalf. Remember, we're talking about a child's welfare. That is what is paramount here. It's much better to be vigilant and wrong than to minimise our fears, squash down what we're saying and decide to do nothing. And then we all find out later that the worst we feared was happening. I know this is a message that I keep saying in the training, and you will hear it a lot, but that's because sadly in the area of child abuse, people most likely are not going to speak up. And that's why the government has made this law so that community responsibility for speaking up is widely known and people will do the right thing by children. One of the most important things for us to remember is that we have both a moral and a legal duty to report abuse. So let's move on now and have a look at another one of these new laws. This one is known as failure to protect. This law is really important if you're on a session or you're a leader, you're in a position where you could actively do something to remove a person who may pose a risk to children. So We all need to hear these laws because it helps us understand our legal responsibilities. If you have concerns that someone is a danger to children or puts a child at risk of abuse within the church, you must report this because the church is legally required to reduce or remove that risk. We cannot leave a person in a role in our churches when we know they pose a risk to the safety of children from abuse. Likewise, we cannot leave a person just in the church without any safety measures when we know that their presence poses a risk to children for their safety from abuse. You might know something, you might have a concern. Call the Safe Church unit confidentially to talk that through. We're here to help you. Remember, we're a resource for the church and we want to help you resolve those things. One of the ways we make our church safer for children is by us knowing about these laws and actually responding to situations that occur in such a way that we are doing the right thing by children and the right thing by our people and the right thing by our church. So thanks for taking the time with me to have a little look through those laws. Remember, you've got the Betrayal of Trust fact sheets with you today, and you can always read through those again. If you want to, there's more information relating to these on the web. Just Google Betrayal of Trust laws and you'll find a wealth of information from the Department of Justice. So let's move along now. We're now going to have a little look at situations involving adults. So, adults in the church can suffer abuse, particularly vulnerable adults. Adult abuse situations could include something like financial abuse, where, say, an elderly person is especially preyed upon or is vulnerable because of their age or their health, and they are financially abused by somebody. A leader could be sexually preying upon somebody under their care. Another sort of situation that might occur is when an adult discloses to you that they've been sexually abused. They might disclose to you that they were sexually abused as a child. You also might find that someone comes to you to talk to you about something in their personal life. Perhaps they're suffering abuse at home and they are looking for help. Those are the kinds of situations that might occur in the church when we're talking about abuse in adults. You'll notice the first part here on the page talks about reporting crime. We're just calling this out in the training to remind ourselves that sometimes we have to remember that just because things take place in a church setting, it doesn't mean that we don't get them to the right avenue for resolution. Look, I'm assuming that you're never going to see the kinds of crimes that are listed here on the page in your church, but let's say you did. It's really important to remember that in those sorts of situations, we call the police. And then we can call the Safe Church unit to let us know what is happening so we can put some resources in to help you and to make sure that we're keeping accurate legal records of what's happening in the churches. And also, you might need some advice about what to do next, how best to practice your duty of care if you're a leader towards people in your congregation, bearing in mind some of the things that might happen. Another form of abuse to be aware of is domestic or family abuse, which is also referred to as domestic or family violence. The presence of domestic or family violence in a marriage or family falls short of the abundant life God promises us in Christ. It deprives the victims of peace, comfort, safety, and the joy that God intends for marriage and family. And where it exists in the body of Christ, it undermines the truth and love of the gospel with devastating effect on the victims, those who love and care for them, and the witness of Christ in both the church and the world. The Presbyterian Church of Victoria is firmly opposed to all forms of domestic and family violence. In fact, the Church has formulated a statement on this matter, and this statement is available at the Safe Church website on the adult page. Where there is family violence and there are children in the household, this is understood to be child abuse. And abuse where there are children involved must follow child protection procedures, as the priority is the protection of children and their need to live and grow in a safe home. The Safe Church unit assists the church in responding to and preventing family violence in our denomination. Contact the Safe Church unit if you have any questions or concerns. So abuse situations involving adults could cover a multitude of things. What are we going to look at today? Well, we're actually going to look at that same disclosure process. If you have an adult disclose to you that they are in an abusive relationship, or perhaps that they were abused as a child, you can follow that disclosure process that's there on page 18. You'll notice that the situation there described, the disclosure process described, is virtually identical to that of children. Always follow the process and finish up by contacting the Safe Church unit to report so that we can help you, so that there's some resources that are made available to you and also to the person if they would like that. Remember, we have recommended Christian counsellors across Victoria that we can refer you to. The main points to remember if an adult makes an allegation of abuse or a disclosure of abuse are to listen, to support them, to document the allegation or report, and then make sure that that information gets to the right avenue for resolution. Always call the Safe Church unit so that we can help you. If you call the police first, that is fine, but do please call the Safe Church unit afterwards and let us know what's happened so we can help you. Again, when we think about abuse situations with adults, let's remind ourselves that our role is not to judge. Our role is not to work out if it's true, if it's false, and judge the veracity of any allegations. Our role is merely to support, listen, document, get that information to the right avenue for resolution. So let's sum up section 2. Child abuse is a real thing and you may well encounter it in your role in the church. I really hope you never do, but we all need to be aware of the issues and ready to know what to do with those concerns that we have. Also remember that abuse can occur between adults in the church, and in that situation, again, we need to know how to respond to those concerns and get those concerns to the right avenue for resolution. And of course, the Safe Church unit is here as a resource for you in these situations. We have a number of things we can put in place to help you. Let's also remember that the betrayal of trust laws have dramatically changed the legal landscape in which we operate as a church in Victoria. Failure to disclose, failure to protect, and the grooming laws mean that we need to be aware and ready to speak up with our concerns so we can put things in place to protect children. Finally, let's just remember there's a disclosure process to follow, and if you have any concerns, don't leave them. There's a safe, confidential place to go with those concerns where you will be listened to and where you will be helped. And that's the Safe Church unit. Don't hesitate to speak up and call the Safe Church unit if you have any concerns. Section 3, Wise Leadership. We're going to start by reminding ourselves that in Safe Church basic training, we're building a picture of what it is to be a safe church. So what have we got already in our picture? Well, you'll remember from section 1, we have the scriptures as our foundation, and we have the code of conduct and the Safe Church policy in the walls or the boundaries of the picture. So now we're going to move from talking about abuse response to talking about abuse prevention. And the two go hand in hand. When we prevent abuse in our churches, It enables us to enhance the safe space that we have already got so that people can worship together, fellowship together, and find out about the love of God. So how are we going to focus on abuse prevention? We're going to talk about two things: wise leadership and wise practices. Remember, you must read the sections 3 and 4 of your training booklet in your own time, so you have a clear understanding of how wise leadership and wise practices help prevent abuse in the church. So again, we're going to begin by looking at the scriptures to lay our foundation of looking at wise leadership. So let's turn now to those scriptures.
After washing his disciples' feet, Jesus said, "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." John 13:13-17. In Matthew 20:25-28, Jesus said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many."
It can be easy to forget the gravity which our roles give us in the church. Just as it's a fantastic thing that in a lot of churches we find that people are very much about a servant attitude and very much about looking after those they serve, we must remember though that those roles do mean that we act in the guise of the church, and it does mean that we need appropriate boundaries in how we behave and lead. So when we lead in the context of ministry, when we volunteer to serve in the context of ministry, we need to remember that we act in the guise of the church, and also that people place a great deal of trust in us, and they're watching us. They're watching us to make sure that we do behave in an appropriate way and that we also represent Jesus Christ to others in the church in a loving way within appropriate boundaries. When it comes to wise leadership in the church, this means we will always prioritise suitability of leaders and volunteers over availability. We only want the right people serving the Lord in the church alongside us. It is a legal requirement for all organisations in Victoria to screen adult volunteers or employees seeking to work with children in the organisation. In the Presbyterian Church of Victoria, this is done by the volunteer approval process. Where we have children who have grown up in one of our churches, turn 18 and become adults and wish to work with children, these people must also undergo the volunteer approval process to be able to legally work with children in the Presbyterian Church of Victoria. This level of scrutiny and this kind of approach is protective for children, but it's also protective for our church as a denomination. It means that we are setting clear boundaries in a wise way that indicate to people that come into our church that we take the safety of children very seriously. The volunteer approval process is facilitated by your Safe Church representative in your congregation. So if you would like more information about this process, speak to your Safe Church representative, or alternatively, go to the Safe Church website. Remember, the website address is on the front of your training booklet. So if you know someone who wants to work with children in the church and they have never worked with children before in the Presbyterian Church of Victoria, direct them to the Safe Church website or direct them to their Safe Church representative so that they understand about the volunteer approval process. You must read the information about boundaries in section 3 of your training booklet. So the Safe Church Code of Conduct is the clearest expression of boundaries when we're talking about wise leadership and acceptable and appropriate behaviour in the Presbyterian Church of Victoria by leaders and all people who work with children under 18. So let's sum up section 3. Section 3 means practicing boundaries. It also means that wise leadership helps us understand boundaries and keep within them and have a plan for how we're going to handle it if boundaries are challenged or violated. And wise leadership also means following the code of conduct, the clearest expression of boundaries in the Presbyterian Church of Victoria. We're continuing focusing on abuse prevention in the church with this final section of training. We're going to think about our ministry practices. Again, our foundation is Scripture. You will see 2 scriptures in the booklet that are helpful for us when we think through some of this material.
And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Colossians 3:17. Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these." Luke 18:16.
You'll also see there that we're going to talk about a thing called the TAP principle. What is the TAP principle? Well, it's an incredibly helpful thinking tool for ministry. It gives us a 360-degree approach to the things that we practically do. The T is for transparency. Whatever we do as leaders, we do in a transparent manner and we don't hide things. The A is for accountability. We recognise that we're accountable to God for how we minister, and we practice accountability with each other as we minister. We don't hesitate to bring other leaders in if we need advice or if we find that we're in a situation that we don't know how to handle. We don't try and handle things ourselves. We remember that we're part of a team. P is for preparation. We think things through before we act. We do all we can to be prepared for situations before they arise, and we plan and we prepare for that. This particularly applies to some of the practical things that we do, such as food preparation or perhaps medication usage. Never be alone with a child out of the view of others in the course of your ministry. This is very important for good practice and wise leadership in our church. Being alone with children in the course of ministry. Basically, don't be alone with a single child where there is nobody else present and nobody else can see you. This is protective for you as a leader as well as protective for the children that you minister to. If a child wants to talk to you privately, then there are ways you can do this. For example, if you're in a large meeting space with a number of people, you could just go off to the corner together and speak privately to the child. Alternatively, there may be a space just outside the main meeting space where there are glass windows or doors between the main space and that smaller space, such as a foyer. You could take the child into the foyer and stand in front of the windows to the main space so everyone else can see you and see exactly what is going on while you speak to that child on your own. Remember, if a child wants to speak to you privately, There are ways you can manage this, but remember the TAP principle: transparency, accountability, preparation. On your team, you could discuss, if a child wants to speak to one of us, how shall we handle that? And then make sure everyone on team knows what to do should that situation arise. That leads us also into the next area, which is visibility in location. Again, there's a document relating to this on the resources page of our website. The main points are: rooms where there's ministry to under 18s should have windows in the doors, and if there are no windows in the doors, leave the door open. As an adult in ministry to children, position yourself in the room where you can be clearly seen by passers-by as they go past. You should be visible and not tucked away where no one can see you. So let's also talk then about adult-to-adult ministry, such as pastoral care, mentoring, or one-to-one Bible studies. Best practice in ministry across all denominations across the globe nowadays is to only minister in one-to-one situations with a person of the same gender as you. Cross-gender one-to-one ministry has been shown time and again to lead to potential issues, whether or not this is the crossing of appropriate boundaries or whether or not this may lead to an abusive situation between adults. So, if you are in adult ministry and you meet one-to-one, best practice is to make sure you're meeting with a person of the same gender. If you're going to be meeting with someone of the opposite gender, you need to put some steps in place to protect yourself and to protect them. This is particularly pertinent for pastoral carers or deacons who perhaps might do home visits to people on their own or potentially meet regularly one-to-one for Bible study. TAP is really helpful here. The first thing is to be transparent about this ministry. Make sure other leaders in the ministry know that you are meeting one-to-one with this person. A for accountability is helpful because by letting people know, we actually say that we are open to that scrutiny and we are openly meeting with these people. We might say to them, we will meet regularly, but we'll meet in a public space. P for preparation comes into play as well. Meet regularly somewhere where you can be seen and where other people know about it. Make a diary note. If you're a minister, let your spouse know. It's just really important to be aware of the possibilities that can arise from situations undertaken with the best will in the world that could go horribly wrong if we're not acting carefully and practicing wisely. If your church doesn't have suitable locations for ministry in terms of visibility, then this is a matter that needs to be looked at. It's a protective thing for the church to have physical facilities that allow people to meet one-to-one, but in such a way that there is transparency in that physical location. Make sure you take the time to read and follow the online smartphone usage guidelines in your training booklet. These are also available on the website. These assist you in using electronic communication in your ministry. Social media breeds fast, intense relationships, and that also is a risk when it comes to abuse prevention. As social media is mostly used in ministry to children under 18, the basic principles ask you to think about 3 things here, and you'll see how TAP applies to each one. The first relates to accountability, the second to transparency, and the third relates to preparation. Think about who you might go to or what you might do if a young person either posts something that concerns you or makes you wonder if they themselves are being abused, or if another leader in the ministry posts something that you think crosses appropriate boundaries. Also, have some thought about what you might do If a person you minister to who is under 18 posts something that crosses a boundary with you on social media. Remember, this also includes things like texting on your phone. By preparing and understanding what you might do if a situation occurs, you will be better equipped to handle it if it does. If you think that on social media or in texting with other people in the ministry that you are straying into unhealthy territory or a place of your own weakness, it's always right to involve another leader in the situation. There is no point in putting yourself in a place of temptation. You need to involve another leader, and that's part of the A for accountability. So remember, as we already said, social media breeds fast and intense relationships that sometimes develop more quickly than is actually healthy. And just remember this when you use it. You'll see there is some advice there about what to do if you ever receive an inappropriate text from someone. Let's move on now to the value of good communication in ministry. Remember, we are thinking about abuse prevention in the training. Clear communication helps prevent abuse because when everyone involved is clear on how the ministry operates, we prevent situations occurring where a person may be able to abuse someone else or where someone may misunderstand something that was intended in an entirely innocent way. When we keep parents informed, for example, and we provide leaders with information, this is an important part of making ministry safe. Indeed, it's much better to over-communicate rather than under-communicate. Don't assume that everyone knows what you know about the ministry. Don't assume that other people will tell others who are new to the ministry what they need to know. Make sure that the communication has been clearly put out there for everyone involved. People don't generally mind hearing the same information many times in different ways, but people will be upset if something happens and they find out later that if they had some more information, they would have made different choices. So good communication is protective for you and for others and for the church. On the resources page of the Safe Church website, there is a document called The Value of Good Communication. It exists to help you in this area. It gives you some helpful tips and advice. Again, if you're not on the internet and you would like a copy of this, please contact the Safe Church unit and we will send you one in the mail. So let's now think about preventative thinking in terms of behaviour. Again, we're thinking about how we practice ministry in the light of the Code of Conduct. This section in particular looks at pastoral care, discipline and physical contact, all areas that can be fraught with issues. Here the approach is to always think first in terms of the Code of Conduct and then in terms of the TAP principle. When we apply these, it helps us act in such a way as to avoid, as far as possible, any issues arising, which is the whole point of preventative thinking. Make sure you read the material in your training booklet so you understand the practical aspects of ministry in the church. If you have any questions, ask your ministry leader or contact the Safe Church unit for guidance. You can do so via phone, text or email. We welcome your inquiry. So let's sum up section 4. Wise practices flow from following the Code of Conduct and applying the TAP principle. Together, our wise leadership and our wise practices are the roof on the Safe Church. So let's now complete our picture we are creating through Safe Church Basic Training. We're going to finish the training where we began, with the focus on our loving God, for whom and in whose name we serve and minister in our church. Remember, safe ministries are healthy, growing ministries. Safe ministries allow people to grow in their faith and go on to bless others. And safe ministries and safe churches are a Christ-like witness to the world. Thank you for completing Safe Church basic training, and thank you for serving in our church in the roles that you do. May the Lord bless you as you continue to do so.